and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? What does sustainability mean anyway? Over the past few years, we spent a lot of time thinking about that question and thinking around how do we keep open source communities going. As you may have noticed, sustainability is also used in another field for the environment, meaning how do we sustain the planet and how do we sustain our collective human civilization on it? Historically, we've tried to err away from focusing on open source sustainability, meaning the sustainability of open source for the environment, just because it's a bit confusing. And we're really interested here in how do we keep open source going. Personally, I've never felt that comfortable with that, but I didn't have a really good venue for talking about it at length, although there have been a few podcasts here and there. Now, however, I'm really happy to announce that we have a new podcast called Open Source for Climate, OSS for climate.sustainoss.org, where we talk specifically to practitioners of open source, developers, funders, policymakers, etc., who are working on open source that is being used for dealing with the climate crisis. So today's episode isn't going to focus on open source in the sense of our normal open source sustainability, but instead is going to be a crossover guest episode. So without further ado, here's an episode of Open Source for Climate, which you can find on ossforclimate.sustainoss.org, which we're building in collaboration with opensustain.tech. In this episode, we're going to talk to Max Jones of Carbon Plan about their work building out open source code for the climate. Enjoy it. And if you can, please share it. This is a new podcast. The more ears, the more eyes we get on it, the better. So, Open Source for Climate. Hello and welcome to Open Source for Climate, the podcast where we talk about open source technology and climate change, the environment, etc., etc. What can we do to make sure that we're all working together to build an awesome digital commons to solve the biggest problem of our time? In fact, edit the in fact out of our time. Very excited to have our guest on today. Today we have Max Jones. Max is calling in from Durham, North Carolina. They are a data scientist, open source software developer. Max, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks for coming on.
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk about this particular thing. So, Max, you are very experienced in this particular field of open source for the climate. A lot of people do a lot of open source work. A lot of people do a lot of climate stuff. Not many people sit at the intersection of the two. But you, just to read from your bio here, you're an open source software developer. You focus on building data and tools for climate action. You lead the open source team at Carbon Plan, which is a nonprofit that works to improve the transparency and scientific integrity of climate solutions. And you also were previously a postdoc at University of Hawaii at Manoa, and you have a PhD from MIT, from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute Joint Program in Oceanography. So you've done very little with your early and mid-20s, and I'm very sorry to hear that. Tell me a bit more about what Carbon Plan does, where you currently sit.
Our work at Carbon Plan is really focused on ensuring that we do more of the climate solutions that work and less of the ones that don't. And we really believe that it's necessary to have transparency and accessibility in our research, in our data, and in our tools in order to accomplish that mission. So a lot of what we do is to build out accessible data products or analyses or comment letters so people can understand what's going on in these different sectors of the climate space and support the approaches that are working the best.
Awesome. So I had emailed someone from Carbon Plan, I think it was a Jeremy, and they said, you're the person to talk to because you are the open source expert. Tell me what chair you actually sit in there and how that works.
Yeah, Jeremy is our executive director. He's wonderful, and he leads our team, and I lead the open source component of that. So it's actually a kind of unique component of our organization because it's both what we call a program area, which is where we try to focus our work, and also a functional area, which is how we do our work. And in open source, we do both. So we're building the tools that underpin large-scale climate analyses, both inside of Carbon Plan and also at other nonprofit industry partners and academic institutions. So that's open source scientific Python tools, if you've heard of X-Ray or XAR. And then we also help our team make the internal products open, accessible, and transparent. So making sure that the code we push to GitHub can actually be run by other people later on, and the data products can be loaded into different applications as well.
So you're working at a nonprofit, which makes it a whole lot easier to write open source code. What I'm curious about is if you're writing open source code and you're releasing it for free, how does the nonprofit fund itself? I know this is Jeremy's problem, not your problem, but I want to know, why is open source important to your mission?
That's a good question. The funding component is mostly Jeremy's problem. We all get involved and contribute where we can, and we're funded through a variety of mechanisms. We do have a lot of individual donor support as well as foundation, and then we also have grants for specific projects, and that is how a lot of the open source as a program area is funded. So we get grants through, for example, NASA, because a lot of the tools that we're building to support climate researchers are also really essential across NASA's entire science mission directorate. For why open source is important, I don't think we can have great climate solutions unless they're open and accessible, especially to the communities that are most impacted by these problems. And if everything's behind a black box or is proprietary, then people can't evaluate whether these proposed solutions are going to work for them.
It's always funny to me to hear that NASA is helping out with climate stuff, because I think NASA and I think of the Martian, which is obviously not NASA's entire mission. They do so much extra work, but it's just really great to hear that they continue to fund nonprofits like yours and continue to fund open source technology that's useful for the climate. Now, we've talked a lot about the general stuff, the nonprofit, how it works. Tell me about the actual code that you're building.
Yeah, one of the main areas of code that we're building are a set of tools and utilities for allowing better visualization of these really large scale climate data sets. So as one example, a lot of the global climate models that we use to understand projections of the climate are at a really coarse scale. But in order for a city to know where they should build a utility or where they need to protect the most, we need finer scale climate data. And so one of the projects we've been involved in is actually producing what we call a downscaled or finer scale climate data. And we've built out an entire tool set so people can view that data and understand the differences between decisions you make in creating those climate products on their browser without needing any software experience or any large scale computing resources. So we're working to build out these tools to show the data in the most accessible ways for scientists as well as the general public. So that is the type of tool set we're building, is this mapping toolkit for data visualization.
A lot of data visualization people end up being data scientists, end up having some code skills. Have you noticed that a lot of people who are using these tools are going back to contribute to the project?
We've had a lot of people reach out via GitHub issues and email with questions about features and about applying the toolkit downstream, but we haven't had a lot of people opening pull requests so far. We've had, I would say, maybe on the scale of 10 to 20 total across the mapping libraries. So it's mostly been an internally driven effort and a collaboration with people on more community developed projects. And that's where we have engagement between our team and the general community of open source software developers.
Can you tell me a bit about the kind of people who are using these tools? You're improving accessibility for mapping tools. That's awesome, and making it not just coarse. What projects have been built using it?
We've had a lot of different people reach out with interest in our tools. So a really exciting example of this was actually open data products that my colleague Oriana Chegwidden did last summer in collaboration with the Washington Post. So we built a data product on how extreme heat will change in the future. And the Washington Post made a series of articles that leveraged that data set and open code repository to show how these climate projections are going to influence people in cities across the globe.
Cool. Okay. Good example about the Washington Post. I feel like the Washington Post is really good at their job in general. It's one of the major outlets. Have you found that people have been using the tool who wouldn't have had the ability to do it otherwise? Are you increasing accessibility in some vector that's normally don't have access to these mapping tools?
That's a great question. I'm not sure about the demographics of who is accessing the tool through the metrics that we get on our website. But we have noticed that when we have journalistic engagement, like the one we did with the Washington Post, we see a lot more activity on our website. And we also see people going deep into the analyses. So we see not only people viewing the tools on our website, but also people navigating to the code base, which I think is really important to get people to understand what actually underpins these products that people are using to make decisions about climate impacts in this case.
I see that. You mentioned cities earlier. Are cities and states, national governments, do you have any idea about who tends to use it more?
Agencies across the board are interested in better understanding climate impacts. And I do know a lot of them are leveraging some of these private analytics companies. And some of what we're trying to do is make sure that the individuals affected can understand what went into those decisions by providing an alternative, more transparent model for this type of analysis.
One of the uses of transparency is reproducibility, which is especially important if you're an academic. Reproducibility is really hard if you don't have, say, an open model for open source for what tools you're using and how you're accessing the data and how to work with the data. Can you talk a bit about how you make sure that it's not just thrown over the wall open source, but how you make sure that people are able to engage with the work that you provide and reproduce the results that you're showing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's pretty complicated. You mentioned that reproducibility is particularly important for academics, but I think it's just as important in the industry and nonprofit sector. And I would love to see more emphasis on it outside of academics as we push towards a more transparent model. As for ensuring that we're not throwing it over the wall, it is a hard problem, especially with some of the more computationally intense workflows that require access to large scale computing. We make sure we are following best practices for packaging up our dependencies and also documenting our approaches. But really what we need is to hear from people who are trying out it and figure out how we can do better. I don't think we've solved this problem of making sure people who aren't us can run the workflows, but we have heard from people already who have tried and where we've fallen short. And that gives us the opportunity to both fix it, sometimes for past examples, and also do better moving forward. So I think it's an iterative process for figuring out how we can make sure that we're living up to the standards that we want to see.
I don't think that work is ever actually done. There's no like, it's a perfect product now, we did it. There's always more to do. Can you tell me a bit more about how you build community around your open source projects? What sort of tools you use, what the community looks like?
A lot of the work we do for building community is through engagement with the Pangeo project, which is a community that was founded back in 2017 by Ryan Abernathy, Joe Hammond, and others. And this is a community that's promoting reproducibility and scalability of earth science workflows. And so we have a lot of community meetings, also a discourse channel where people can join and ask questions about how to approach different problems. And it's also just a really fun and welcoming place to talk about the things we're really passionate about, which for a lot of us includes open source, climate, and in general, geospatial challenges.
Looks like a really cool community. I'm looking at it online at pangeo.io, community platform for big data geoscience. I'm curious, one of the issues with working at a nonprofit is a lot of the times you're really focused on your mission. You're really focused on this is what we're doing, working on this tool for this funder or this subset of people who are working for. How do you authentically engage in a community of people like this without making it all about you or about your particular software? Are you collaborating on other people's projects? Are you working together with researchers from other areas? What does that look like?
I think the key point there for us is to find the common needs. So we're trying to use the tools to promote better climate solutions, but the strategies for doing that are actually really similar to what people need in other fields. So on a finer scale level, for example, one of the utilities we've built is a more efficient data loader to feed large scale n dimensional data sets into machine learning models. And that is a problem that exists across the earth sciences. So we've engaged with people in other disciplines to share our insights on how to best approach these challenges using the tools that we've built. Even broader than that, there are data standards that are relevant across all of science. So we've contributed to the czar project, which is data storage model that allows efficient IO and storage, especially on the cloud. And that has been used across so many disciplines and is a great example of doing work that is necessary for our mission, but also allows really broad engagement and benefits a lot of different disciplines in science.
That's ZARR, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Cool. There's a lot of different spellings for czar. I just realized in my head. This looks really cool too. A community to develop specifications in software storage. I like that. I realized I didn't ask earlier. When you say we, is that you and Jeremy, or how many other people are on your team?
We have a team of 14 right now, and we're spread across a few different areas of work. So the open source team is me and a fantastic data engineer, Raphael Hagen. We also have people in each of our program areas. So that's climate impacts, carbon offsets, and carbon dioxide removal. And then we have a wonderful operations team and editorial lead.
It looks like czar, as I'm going through their website, is a sponsored project of NumFocus, which is another 501c3, which is awesome. They do amazing work. I love NumFocus. Leo Silent is my favorite. Can you tell me, how do you compete in the funding landscape as a nonprofit for your open source tools? So I understand that there's, hey, we're doing all this work and it's really great. Do you know anything about the allocation of funds within your company to the open source projects itself or to your pay? Is that something you think about, long-term contributions that are necessary to keep the project going?
I do think a lot about the funding models for open source moving forward. So our organization was established by 3 co-founders, including Jeremy and also Joe Hammond, who now works as CTO at a startup called Earthmover. And he was really instrumental in getting some of the first funding that we had for open source as a program area. And that included work through NASA as well as engagements with Microsoft. And moving forward, we're pursuing a lot of those same types of opportunities. So government solicitations or open calls. And I think it's great that a lot of agencies, including NASA, are continuing to support both new tools that they need for their work and also the maintenance of existing open source software libraries, which has historically been a difficult part of open source to fund. And it's really, really great that there's opportunities for that. And a lot of that is because of the work that places like NumFocus have done.
Do you help collaborate back upstream to any of your dependencies?
Yeah, absolutely. We contribute broadly to a lot of the open source tools that we use in our workflows. And also, whenever we find a bug, we try to at least open an issue, which I think is a pretty valuable way to contribute when you don't necessarily have the time or expertise with the code base to submit a fix.
So if we zoom out a little bit, it sounds like you're doing awesome work. It sounds like you personally and your team are doing great work reaching out and being part of other communities of data scientists, and you're making tools available to other people who may not have access to finer grained satellite data about the climate, which is excellent and really, really important. One of the questions I have that I don't know the answer to is, why couldn't this work also be done by a closed source company? Is it necessary that you really have open source, or does it just give your work longer legs, right? Is it a without which not for the work that you do, or is it an affectation? Is it because you're a nonprofit and you're trying to lead a better world, or you're trying to lead to better science?
It's definitely towards the latter. So we're trying to make a better world. There are companies already that are doing the same type of analyses that we're doing, but entirely closed source and selling their products to governments. There's also, for example, in our offsets work, there's a large offsets industry, and a lot of our commentary is about how the lack of transparency leads to bad outcomes. So we're built around open source because we don't think it can be done well without open source. There's also companies that are more on the technological side that fall somewhere in the middle. Like you mentioned ArcGIS, I think earlier. Esri is both a proprietary company, but they're also engaged in a lot of the same conversations that we are. And they do have a component that is focused on supporting governments and having accountability in their climate solutions.
You mentioned Esri is part of other conversations. And of course, you mentioned that you're part of things like Czar. Tell me a bit more about the other aspects of open that are important to the work that you're doing. So standards is one of them, which you've already brought up. Open standards is really important. What about open knowledge, open data sets? Do you have any open hardware that you work with? I'm just curious about the larger scale of what you're doing as an idealistic, scrappy company trying to make sure that everything is available and public, because otherwise it's bad science.
We try to leverage other organizations that share the similar values whenever we can to have open components that aren't necessarily tied to our vision. So a community that I would encourage people to check out that we use is Nabari, which we have leverage for being able to do scalable and reproducible computing on the cloud. So they are trying to solve, along with 2I2C, which does great work, scalable and open computing. That's not something we can do as a team of 14 when we're also trying to solve these massive climate problems. So I think it's really important to keep an eye for these opportunities to work with and build off of like-minded companies and communities like Nabari and like 2I2C.
Do you have access to a large compute cluster, or do you run that in-house?
We have our clouds on a few different platforms. So for a lot of the computation, we use AWS. Previously, we've used GCP. We've recently started working with hosting our data sets on open storage network. And we're really excited about the potential there to have a bit more of a sustainable model for long-term storage of some of these large data sets without being beholden to some of these mega corporation cloud providers.
Internally, do you talk a lot about the fact that storage and computing power takes up a lot of carbon itself? And how do you offset that?
It's something that I've thought about a lot. There are tools that you can use to evaluate what the carbon cost is of different workflows. It's not something that I typically optimize around, but we do try to build tools that will allow both ourselves and other people to have more efficient workflows. So we think by investing and using the credits and the infrastructure to develop, for example, a more efficient data loader that will benefit so many people downstream that it's worthwhile spending those resources on. I think we could think a lot more about it, though, at the same time. I think it's a really important part of climate modeling, especially as people are building out more digital twins and other really computational intensive parts of it. And it's something that I would love to have a better personal framework about reconciling.
Yeah, it's a tough problem too, partially because we're using the tools that built the problem to try to solve the problem at the same time, right? We need to actually run these things to understand so we can change how we run these things. So good work having those conversations, and keep it up, and we'll see where we are in a few years.
Yeah, I think it also touches on an important distinction of where our organization lies. Everyone knows that we need reduced emissions, which is what you're talking about. You're talking about reducing the emissions we're using for our computational workflows. And in order to do that, we need better energy solutions. And there are a lot of organizations that are working on that. That's not the main mission of our organization at this time. We're focused on things that are also necessary for the parts of society that we won't be able to cut emissions from, because in addition to that, we will need carbon dioxide removal. And we also need to understand the impacts of climate change and how to adapt to them. So that's the closer subset to what we're trying to address.
That makes sense. And all these problems are also intersectional, right? So we need better democracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in order to have these effective structures to help decarbonize our continued infrastructure. Which leads me to my next question, which is what's really hard right now for you in terms of open source code, in terms of what you're working on? Is there any problem that's really difficult?
I don't have a solution to this problem, but I do see that we need to solve the market situation with open source. How can we get people to have their data sets public when they also need to make money, in a lot of cases, meet shareholder demands? That's a large problem. I don't know how to solve it, but I would love if we had a better system where we could just have everything that people are relying on be open and accessible.
Do you think that where you're situated is also part of the answer to that question? So when we think about nonprofits who are running similar code to for-profit companies that are proprietary, you may not know the metrics of how many people are using your code or whether they were able to use it and use your data without having to say pay for a paywall to go somewhere else and get it. And so as a result of that, it's hard to really track what the impact of your work is, but that impact is still a necessary part of actually affecting change. It may not be the best story you could put on a brochure or something because you may not know the numbers of how these things work. But having a nonprofit that's small and scrappy, but working towards an idealistic end does help the long arm of technology to be slightly better in the future. At least that's my hope. Do you think that's accurate, or am I totally misguided in my wishes?
That's absolutely my hope as well. And I think we are moving the marker at the very least, right? We're showing that this type of work is possible and that you can build open source software that is used and does help us move towards climate solutions. And there's also a need for other approaches. Hopefully, this will increase the transparency that they adopt in theirs too. So I think you're absolutely right that it's an important, at least, demonstration of what is possible.
Is there anything coming up soon that you're really excited about?
We have a few projects that are going to come out soon, but one project that recently came out that I really think people should check out is this project called Offsets DB, which is a harmonized data set of carbon offset projects and credits. And it allows people to explore different offset projects and what has been used or retired. And already it surfaced some really interesting dynamics for our team in the carbon offsets market. And it's a very fun API that our product team built. So I think it's a really cool project that people should check out that we put out just a month or two ago.
Where can people learn more about your work?
People can learn more about Carbon Plan at carbonplan.org. We also have a GitHub repository where you can explore all the open source tools and data sets that we've built. And then from a community perspective, I encourage people to check out the page that you mentioned earlier, pangeo.io, and join us on the discourse there.
And where can people learn more about you and your work?
All of my work pretty much happens on GitHub. So you can find me at Max R. Jones on GitHub.
This is great. Thank you so much for coming on and for sharing. Don't leave yet. Now we have another part of the show called Spotlight, where we highlight other people's projects, things, books, anything that has helped us out in the past, and we feel like we should just put a little bit more light on. Traditionally, the host goes first, but I've also run out of a lot of ideas because I've hosted way too many spotlights. So I'm just going to spotlight this New Yorker article that I really liked recently, which is about the Brazilian special forces that's working to basically fight in the Amazon. They actually are basically scientists with guns who go around fighting illegal mining. It's pretty intense, but it was a really, really good expose on it. Highly suggest checking it out. That's the New Yorker from April 2024. So that's my spotlight. I just thought it was really cool. Max, what's your spotlight today?
I would like to spotlight this open access perspectives article that my postdoc advisor put out. It's called The Origins of the Generic Mapping Tools from Table Tennis to Geoscience. This was published recently by Paul, and it highlights how he built this open source geospatial toolbox called the Generic Mapping Tool. It is truly incredible that he funded this through NSF for 30 years continuously during his career. And just as a person, Paul was amazing. He really influenced my career, so many other people's careers. And I think this perspective highlights his personality. He is just such an incredible developer and also has a great sense of humor, which comes through. This is a bit of an academic article, so I would encourage people to check it out.
I will definitely read that. Please share this podcast wherever podcasts are sold, bought, tendered, whatever. Like it if you can. Put it on LinkedIn, put it on Mastodon, Blue Sky, and any other federated social networks that do not include the Network X. And in general, be amazing people. Thank you again, Max Jones, for coming on. It was really great to have you. Good luck with everything at Carbon Plan. I think it's super awesome that you're doing this work. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to chat with you.